Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guest is Johnathan Bi, philosopher and investor. We talk about Rene Girard and his theory of mimetic desire. We talk about contemporary events, Bitcoin and altcoins in the light of mimesis. Johnathan Bi, how's everything going?
Everything's going great. I'm super excited for this conversation.
Yeah, same here. And, where in the world are you right now?
The city of sin, Manhattan itself.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say Vegas. That's usually the city of sin. But
Vegas is more bodily sin, right? There's more, there's a more diversity, if you will, of sins in New York. New York offers a whole, appetizer plate of sins.
Yes, you can have any sin that you want, I guess. Yeah, interesting. How is it in New York these days? I feel like the place has been very volatile the last couple of years.
I think it has, but I think we've hit a probably equilibrium. A lot of my friends, me included, I was going to school here in the city when COVID hit, and I left around March 2020. A lot of my friends did leave as well. I traveled around. A lot of my friends traveled around. There was this supposed huge exodus from New York to places like Miami and Austin, but it turns out a lot of those folks ended up coming back. So right now, most of my good friends are back in New York. So I think the city's alive and well.
Well, I mean, I'm here in Austin, and I know there's a lot of people that moved here, but I suppose many of them maybe moved back.
Yeah,
so
especially the younger crowd. Like I actually moved to Austin for about 2 years, but eventually I ended up moving back.
Well, that's maybe like a good jumping off point because, a lot of the reason why, at least for me, a lot of young people move to places like New York or big cities is it isn't because of the high rents or things like that. It's because of something else. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I guess the desire that a lot of people have to move to the big city.
Yeah. Well, maybe to tie it to the conversation that I imagine you want to be having, which is around Girard, I would first give a very brief overview of Girard's theory of desire. And he essentially thinks that human desires there's generally two strands of human desires. One is physical desire, and that is aimed at objects or what objects can do for us. And one is metaphysical desire, and that is what objects really say about us. And I'm using objects here in the broadest sense possible. Experiences, friends, relationships, job titles, and even cities that we choose to live in. And so one clear example of this is, some people, when they have sex, they're just there to experience something, right? Whether it's physical intimacy or pleasure in the moment. But also, there's a clear archetype of people who are looking to have sex to be someone. Right? They're not out to experience something, but to prove something. And this is the psychology of the coquette or the Don Juan, where they see their ability to seduce, to dominate sexually as saying something core about their identity. And I think this bifurcation really extends across the spectrum, right? Where you can do a job because you like the day-to-day, or you can do a job because, you enjoy what it says about you. And I think that the same exists for cities, and perhaps more obviously within cities, postal codes. Right. I grew up in Vancouver, and the wealthiest part of it was called, West Vancouver. And when you ask people where they live, when someone's from West Vancouver and they tell you that, you get a feeling that it's less about trying to communicate information about actually where they live, but more so who they are. And I think due to no small part, people move to cities because they think through cultural influences and through media that a certain city is associated with a certain type of person, right? And maybe from New York, that's Sex in the City, or I don't watch a lot of movies, so you don't have to tell me. But so yeah, and one thing I'll say is, in some sense, Girard doesn't consider this as he does consider this as a bad thing about human nature, but in some sense, it's inevitable, right? Because before we actually have experience of something, we have to go by our cultural associations and who we associate an object with, right? Before I moved to New York, and I have no experience of being in New York, I kind of have to go, through this metaphysical desire. And the same thing is true with finding a job. When you ask a kid, what do you want to be? And if they show a strong desire, I want to be a fireman, I want to be an investment banker, I want to be an entrepreneur, an investor, a professor. Of course, they are motivated by metaphysical desire because they do have no physical desire, right? A desire for experience with the object itself, because they have no experience in history or track record, if you will, with that. In some sense, I think it's inevitable. But with this bifurcation in view, I think we can also develop a model of what it means to grow up in a sober manner, right? And that is to switch more and more of our metaphysical desires to physical desires once we've gained an experience of different things and have a better idea of what we really want.
Well, so this idea of physical and metaphysical desire, the idea that there are certain things that we need, like sleep or, food, or maybe even like like having a mate or something like that. Those are different, as you're saying, than metaphysical desires, which are really more about, things that aren't necessarily things that your body wants or something like that. It's something that almost like your soul wants, something at almost a spiritual level. Is that right?
That is right. Although I would be hesitant to draw too strong of a distinction between metaphysical and physical based on what the object is. And let me clarify here. Even drinking water, right, which is what our body wants, one can be mediated by remembering how our favorite athlete drinks Gatorade in those Gatorade commercials, right? So even something like that can be greatly mediated. Or to use a much more clear example, hopefully a clear example, fine dining, right? That's clearly something our body wants, but something like fine dining versus eating at a halal food cart in New York is clearly more motivated by metaphysical desire. So I would be hesitant to demarcate activities into like what the body wants and what the soul wants, and instead viewing every human activity as being able to be corrupted or infested, if you will, by metaphysical desire.
Yeah, and in that way, the demarcation isn't by activity. It's much more about what you're trying to get out of the activity.
Precisely. Yes.
Yeah. So for me, like if I'm going to sleep, that's getting rest or something like that. But if you're aiming to sleep on a fancy hotel with 5-star hotel at the penthouse or something like that's something different. It says something about you. But going back to I guess talking about Girardian thought, the insight to me that I thought was I think everyone quotes this from Girard. Our desire for things, especially metaphysical things, it's not a desire for the thing itself, but it's a desire to be. Can you explain that concept a little bit?
Yeah, and of course. And this is one of the central ideas of Girard. So you're right to latch onto it. And I think we've already covered it. In fact, his desire to be is none other than metaphysical desire. So one way to understand the distinction between physical and metaphysical desire is that physical desire is a desire for experience, and a metaphysical desire is the desire to be. Now, I think we can say actually a few more things and to dive into this concept a bit deeper about what it means to be. And I think, and this is my interpretation, you're not going to find it internally within Girard, that we can actually read Girard as saying that there's 3 different types of being that we want. Or like we can be a bit more clear than just say desire to be. And the first is that I think we desire to be eternal. And an example of this is I think one of the reasons why Instagram is so seductive is that it is able to eternalize an instant, right? To take the best moment of your life and for you to record that and derive social value of it through time. And obviously before Instagram, people satisfied this drive towards permanence through different ways, right? Whether it's building an empire, writing a very important book, or putting their name on a park bench, having progeny. So that's one of the goals of being. Another one is reality. And the reality here isn't the reality of tables and chairs, the reality of the mic we're talking to and the computer that the mic is plugged into, but more of a social reality, right? And to continue to using this Instagram example, there's the unfortunately all too common saying, pics or it didn't happen, Instagram or it didn't happen. If I didn't post pictures of my trip to Hawaii, did I go there? Did I really go there? Right. And when people say things like that, it's clearly what they're clearly not saying is, if I didn't post a picture of my Hawaii trip, the trip literally didn't happen. Right. What they are saying is that there is an agreed upon domain really of reality that in some sense more real and more important even than the physical reality of tables and chairs. And another great example of this, I think, is video games, right? And especially the stereotype of the modern sort of gamer who has this, pristine character with a shining sword and a six pack, but they themselves can be quite, unfit, and they don't treat their physical bodies because that's what their social environment tells them to really put emphasis on, right, in this virtual world. And just to wrap this up very quickly, the last strand of being that Girard thinks we want is he thinks we want to be a causal force. And here we can understand this through Nietzsche's lens of the will to power, right? We want to act upon the world that is congruent with our self-conception. And sometimes this means, conquering the world like Napoleon, but at other times, if you're a retired mom, it just means like exerting your force through the school board, right? And making sure people aren't like getting too close in school dances or something like that. And the one thing I'll say is that Girard thinks that these three core ideals within being, permanence, power, and reality, are in some sense unachievable by man. That we in some sense are these like petty sacks of meat. And what we're really yearning for is to be almost an eternal God, right? In fact, these are the metaphysical qualities of the Christian God. And so Girard thinks, in this very pessimistic view of human nature, that the delta between this ideal and our lived experience, that we are not as real as we want to be, that we do not exist as long as we want, and that we don't exert the extent of power that we wish we could. This delta, this fundamental lack, is what really drives us. That behind most of human activity is this fundamental lack. It's almost as if we are sort of children who are just failing over and over and over again to meet the expectations of an overly demanding parent. The way we go about trying to satisfy these ends, right? Because as you can see, these ends are highly abstract, is by imitating a model that we conceive of having being, and then doing or pursuing the objects that are close and proximate to them. And herein lies Girard's concept of triangular desire, that desire is rarely unidirectional, just from person to object, but it's usually triangular, right? It's mediated by some kind of model. So in other words, the models, or a colloquial way to understand this would be the prestigious people around us set the fundamental standards of what it means to exist in great measure in the way that we want to. They sort of take this very abstract ideal of being real, of being eternal, of being powerful, and then through their actions and their associations in the world, set up the standard of what it means in that society, in that social environment to be. So this is also a theory, of course, of also how prestige works. And on a face value, it's quite a relativistic theory, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, that last comment that you said about this is how prestige works. Because as I've been studying Girard, the thing that keeps popping out at me is how related this thing is to the entire structure of status games that we essentially play. And status games are, of course, by nature, zero sum. And there can only be, one person at the top, and, sort of going up and down the status hierarchy is a large part of that metaphysical desire, this desire to be at a higher point. And the conflict that he talks about with respect to, mimetic violence and sort of, the desire and this, coming together where people act more and more like each other. And I think he calls them mimetic doubles. It's essentially this, trying to align themselves so that they can be at the top of the status hierarchy. How does Girard's how do Girard's theories on mimetic desire and desire for being square with sort of like the structure of human society, generally where there's some sort of status hierarchy that people compete over.
I think that's you really should be giving me these lectures for me, because that's the exact next logical step that you need to take it, which is, so we've discussed the psychological motivations of one individual. How does this manifest when sort of we have people in a group? And this is an entire sort of hour and a half lecture, which was like lecture 3 in the lecture series. But I'll try to give you an overview, and I'll start somewhere interesting, which is it can turn what are positive sum games in the physical world, in the world of experience, in the world of goods, in the world of materials, whatever word you want to use, into zero sum or even negative sum games in the social world. And let me give you a few examples, right? Think about the time when someone close and proximate to you, so someone who's doing what you're doing, desiring what you're desiring, gained an advantage that is actually beneficial to you, but you still felt really, really bad and threatened. And I think there's too many examples here, right? Whether if I'm an investor and I see my friend's portfolio double, triple, quadruple, right? Then I think it's natural for people to feel a bit threatened. If I'm a bodybuilder and my buddy hits a PR and I'm stuck there, right? Again, I think the same feeling emerges. If I'm an academic and my peer publishes more papers than me, and the examples just go on and on and on. And I think what's really interesting about these examples, right, is if what I really want to do is to practice philosophy, is to be a better investor, is to lift more weights. If that is what I really want, then these experiences should make me feel happy, right? Because fundamentally, these are not zero-sum domains, at least in the physical, material, experiential world. My friend who's a better trader is going to be able to, give me tips and surface good investment ideas. My friend who's a better lifter obviously is going to help me grow. And the same thing obviously exists in the academic publishing and philosophy. But the reason, the very fact, also, Jimmy, I'm going to pause here for a bit. My computer went to sleep for a bit, but you can still hear me, right? You didn't break out?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll restart. These domains are in the physical world are positive sum, but the fact that we feel threatened and I think it's uncommon, if not necessary, to feel threatened when these things happen. Just give an idea of how little we care about experience, right? And how much we care about the social stuff. And the argument really is this. What is at stake in these games often is one's self-conception, right? Well, I don't want to make good trades. I want to be an investor. I don't want to live a lot of weights. I want to be a bodybuilder. I don't want to understand philosophy. I want to be known and recognized as a philosopher. And when that is the fundamental model that you start viewing human nature, then this sort of apparently petty phenomenon and a trivial sort of disputes start making a lot of sense, right? If what is at stake is our being, and if our being, which is the aims of reality, power, and eternality, is fundamentally exclusive, right? And I think it is, because in the world of being a philosopher, my reality, right, of people reading my books is somewhat going to take away from your reality. And if if people look back in the early 21st century and say, Johnathan is the best investor, then that's going to take away, right, that's the eternality part of being, then that's going to take away other people's ability to get that fundamental good. So in other words, by this Copernican shift of reevaluating what humans are really after, not as after physical goods, not as utility maximizing machines, but as fundamentally social creatures, perversely fascinated with our position in society. He shows the fundamentally zero and often negative sum relations, even when humans are in actually positive sum games. And, I think the most striking example of this is, and I talked about this in lecture 1, is the relationship between China and America, or the Sino-American relationship. And I think because of the naive assumptions of people in the West in the early 2000s and certainly in the 90s, they believed that economic liberalization would lead to a greater harmony between China and the United States. And I think the flawed argument went something like this. Once the Chinese get integrated into the economic order, they will become richer and therefore happier. And the Americans will also be richer through cheaper Chinese goods, and they will also be happier. And in some sense, the descriptive prediction happened, right? The Chinese did become richer, and the Americans also had a higher standard of living, at least more cheap goods because of it. But a Girardian will come in and say, and Girard did say this, proximity is what really puts people in competition. And the Chinese, who are now closer to the Americans, will feel greater jealousy. And the Americans, who are now, closer to the Chinese, will feel much more threatened. And the absolute increase in the raw amount of goods matters little to us as social creatures than this sort of change in relativistic social standing in comparison.
Well, that brings up an interesting question, because as I've been reading this, the thing that really kind of struck me is how much mimetic theory applies to international politics. And you pointed out this example of the United States and China, but like going back in history, one of the things that I was studying was World War II and what was happening. One of the things that really drove, Soviet Russia, the USSR, this supposed communist paradise that they were building, was they were looking at other nations and saying, wait, they have this, we must also get this. And they had this sort of like prestige kind of thing. And we see this a lot in the Olympic Games and things like that, where, it's almost like a proxy war of competing mimetic, desires of proving that, my country is superior or something like that. How much does it play into even things at a, very vast and macro level, rather than, just, something that might be happening at your office? How much does, mimetic theory apply to something really macro?
Yeah, I think it applies a tremendous deal. In fact, there's an entire book called Psychopolitics, written by one of Girard's interlocutors, that tackles this fundamental question. He uses the Girardian framework to examine essentially international relations, and I think it's quite illuminating. And in it, one of the examples he gave is how close bin Laden and the terrorists were to America. I mean, bin Laden, I think I'm going to butcher this, but I'm pretty sure he studied, if not in America, and then in the West. And I think some of the 9/11 terrorists, just a few days before they crashed the plane, they were like, I think, like partying it up in some kind of like Western bar. I forget the exact example. Please read the book, because I think I butchered that. But the idea is that it applies a great deal. And the reason is because one can examine national identities and national self-conceptions, or even class identities and class self-conceptions as through this Girardian ego that we've outlined. And one example I can give you of, if not a national conflict, then certainly a class conflict, is I think Greece in, I believe it's around 500 BC, so about 2,500 years ago. This was, I think, after the time of Homer, before the time of Socrates, and Greece society was undergoing a great transfer in wealth through the introduction, I think, of slaves through conquest, as well as the developing of proto-markets. And what happened here was that the upper classes, the aristocracy, sort of stayed the same. And as so many of these introduction of the markets go, the sort of middle class, right, the merchant trading class, started to gain more and more power and wealth. And then a few interesting things happened. One is that they started getting closer. The merchant class, right? This was the previous middle class that is starting to approach the aristocracy, or the nouveau rich, if you will. They started imitating fundamentally aristocratic practices that were just fundamentally unthinkable to them about 100 years ago. And the key one, right, is pederasty. The practice of sort of aristocratic males having sexual relations with their mentees, with young boys, right? So it's a form of pedophilia. And so the rising merchant classes, because of their proximity to the aristocracy, they felt legitimized to practice this fundamentally aristocratic practice. But there's also an interesting psychology of resentment going on. Whereas through politics, they try to ban all aristocratic practices while secretly practicing it themselves. And a similar sort of psychology happened with the aristocratic class. They were, as the old money so often is to new money, they were both jealous, but also wanted a piece of the new money. And so while they all partook in commerce, they started devaluing commerce. They made having money crude, and they set up new standards of virtue, namely honor. And so, this is another example where you can apply this, fundamentally, simplistically, zero-sum type of mentality to not only two individuals, but to two classes, right? If you can do that with two classes, then you can do that with two nation states as well.
Yeah, and fundamentally, what we're talking about is this this idea of envy, which, at least in the areas that I study, particularly in economics, it's almost never sort of like taken into account. If you read anything by a modern economist, say, they assume each person to be
rational
like Homo
utility
economicus,
precisely.
Yeah. Homo economicus, right? Like they will maximize utility. They don't care about what their neighbor is doing or anything like that. But what you're positing is, and what Girard is positing is, actually those things matter quite a bit. What your neighbor is doing, especially a neighbor that you admire, and what you do, matters a great deal to other people that are observing you and want to be more like you, and so on. And it is this sort of like, I don't know, like there's a different force here, and it's all about that social zero-sum status game that isn't taken into account when you're talking about, all of the things that are going on in, normal relations within any community. But going back to this like positive sum, zero sum thing, naturally, there are lots of positive sum activities. So if you are creating some good, like, you're turning iron ore into cans or something like that, that's a positive sum game from an economics perspective. But there is a tendency for people to turn even those things into zero sum games. And it's related to this thing that you said earlier, our desire for permanence, power, and so on. How is it that this ends up resolving itself? Because you have a lot of people that want the same things. They want to be at the top. It isn't about utility or, gaining wealth even, or, material goods. It's about something else. How does that resolve itself?
Yeah. So before we go there, I actually want to build upon our conversation. One is to actually make the argument that some of the times it's not only zero sum, but it's actually negative sum. And then the second is to reaffirm your sort of economic intuition. But I'll start with the first one. So what we consider to be positive sum games is you win, I win. Zero sum games is you lose, I win. And then there probably can be another category of you lose, I lose, where it's connected fundamentally to this Girardian idea of envy. Because Girard thinks, if I'm mediated by a model who's far away, right, Shakespeare or something like that, I think we tend to feel less threatened by them. We tend to blame them less for our own failure. However, if we are mediated by someone very close and proximate to us, and here all the examples I gave before, right, of your best friend, making more money than you in stock markets. Your lifting buddy lifting more than you. Your academic buddy, getting the more prestigious job than you. Girard thinks that even when this is not literally the case, we tend to, and this is simply an empirical statement, we tend to start blaming them, right, as robbing us of our being. So this lack that we talked about, this fundamental lack that we will actually never satisfy, no matter what we do, we start blaming some of this onto others. And what this gives us a reason to do, or rather, what psychology this inspires, is actually a reason to hurt others just for the sake of hurting others, right? And unfortunately, this is a psychology, even if most people don't experience it. But I think it'd be hard to argue that this isn't a psychology that real humans face, right? That even if I were to lose, if you lose more than me, I am happy, right? So I just wanted to build upon that point, that it's not just negative sum games like making you lose to make me win. Girard's psychology gives individual reasons to make other lose, even if you yourself do not gain, or even if you lose, because you feel resentment and you attribute blame to them, right? But then let me go to my second point about the economic intuition, because I think there's a lot more that we can say here. The first thing I'll say is that I think that's So,
Mm-hmm.
I've been building a fintech business in the sort of wealth management space for the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that when you talk to a lot of wealth managers that you realize is that in their relationship with their clients, right, performance actually matters a lot less than people might prima facie think going into the industry. In fact, when you're sort of constructing portfolios for your clients, obviously, you do a sort of risk reward analysis, right? And obviously, a lot of times, risk is measured by max loss. One important way to think about max loss is how much of your portfolio can go down, and you still meet your child's like payments or like physical demands by the world, right? Like you can still pay rent, you can still retire in the age you want. But perhaps what is even more important is what is the max loss that you can stomach, right? And so if you look at the fintech space when it comes to portfolio construction, a lot of the tools that people are being built are actually trying to tease out this sort of second type of loss. How much psychological loss can you really stomach, right? Not what you actually need, but how much can you stomach? And so there's some tools, run you through scenarios and say, if 08 happened again, this is how much you would lose. And you try to gauge the response of your clients. But another important factor of this, right, is how well your portfolio is doing compared to others. And I think that's a fundamental sort of argument against the sort of homo economicus, right? If everyone's down 50% and I'm down 30%, I'm feeling pretty good, right? If everyone is up 50% and I'm up 40%, I'm going to start pointing fingers. And this is often how things go. And it's a very delicate balance that a lot of these wealth managers have to work with. But I think it goes much further beyond just that. Even I think our core notions of economic value is grounded upon this mimesis, right? Just think about all the different types of currencies that have existed throughout society. I think the most extreme example of this, I can't remember where, I think it's one of the Pacific Islands. The indigenous peoples there, their currencies were these like giant stone wheels, right?
Rye stones, yeah.
Precisely. That's the example I was thinking about. And then, one of the crazy stories was one of these wheels, I think, was trying to be transferred through a boat, and it sunk in the water. But they could still use that to trade. And we were just like, what do you mean? They're like, well, no, it's in the bottom of the lake. Well, we're like, but the stone is the currency, surely, right? But if you look at our own economic system, how much of it is grounded by just like shoveling paper and changing numbers on economic ledgers, right? And this is even more true for Bitcoin. You see the truly mimetic foundations of value itself. Anyways, so that's to, I just gave, two arguments there. One to sort of push the argument even further that not only are relations zero sum, they can be negative sum. And the second point is this economic point that we're really, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let's dive a little deeper into the economic point, because I find this very fascinating. I think it explains to some degree this fascination that a lot of people have with altcoins. Because what you were saying with altcoins,
yes.
Coins other than Bitcoin,
yeah.
Because they focus so much not on whether or not their portfolio is growing at a certain rate. It's making sure that you beat other people, or in the case of a lot of people that have come in later, it's to catch up to the people that have, that were in this space for a long time. And that sort of like motivation based on, I guess, envy or, a desire to be at the top of the status hierarchy, and, which in this case would be measured by, how much money you've made or something like that. That is an enormously strong motivator for why people take a lot of really ridiculous risks, and you get, blow-ups like Luna. How much of human suffering do you think is because of this streak of envy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me just make one more point, and then I promise I'll answer. I'll start actually answering your questions instead of just leading us down one after the other. The one more point I was going to make is that I actually think, and hopefully to your listeners who I think are more, economics is a great way for them to enter into mimetic theory. I think this bifurcation we drew between physical and metaphysical desire actually exists in the valuation of assets as well. or to put it this way, that the more the asset's fundamental valuation is grounded on, speculation is too loaded of a word, but we'll say like hypotheticals and not just fundamental cash flows we can point to, right? I think the more it is subject to these mimetic forces. So in this universe, the cash flows are the object of physical desire, and the sort of growth, if you will, right, is the domain of metaphysical desire. And this is why, if I have an infrastructure company, and all we do is that we have 2 roads and we collect 10% toll on the roads, we're not going to have a massive speculative bubble around that, right? Because it's grounded in reality. And so this is also a helpful point because it reels back in human nature a little bit. We're not just people who just endlessly build towers in the sky, so to speak, but it is checked against reality. But my point is that there are certain domains to market, if you will, or whose check against reality is much less frequent, and its results are much harder to interpret. And as a result, those domains, mimetic illusions or delusions, if you're not feeling too charitable, are much easier sustained, right? And so a growth tech stock whose most of their profits are not based on cash flows you can point to, but based on some kind of story that they tell, this is our TAM, we're only 10%, here's how we can cross-sell. The more an asset is subject to speculative frenzy, because there's no way you can check that narrative, right? And something like Bitcoin is almost on the extreme of that, because it doesn't even claim, like, cash flow does not factor into it at all, right? And it tells probably the most speculative and hardest to validate story of being a sort of a global currency.
Well, yeah, it's supposed to be money which has very different characteristics than an investment. But going back to what you were saying about this speculative frenzy, the sort of almost mimetic desire to own the stock that sort of takes over. I've seen this a lot in our space, especially with respect to something like Dogecoin. But it's also happening a lot more in the stock market with something like Hertz, which was a bankrupt company. Everyone knew it was a bankrupt company, but the stock pumped regardless. We saw something similar with GameStop, AMC, a lot of these sort of Wall Street bet type things. At least for me, it seemed almost Nietzschean, where there were a few core people that decided to use the desire of others to, imitate them to pump something. And, I think in economics, this sort of like contest of what's more popular is what we call like a Keynesian beauty contest. That dynamic completely takes over, and the fundamentals don't matter at all.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think, using mimetic theory, that as you pointed out, it's a lot easier to explain.
Totally. And, just to be clear here, when we say, and because I wanted to make this as plausible to our listeners as possible, when we say that a few individuals ask us to imitate their, and to buy Bitcoin, I think if Girard was to analyze this, he wouldn't say, we look at, our rich friend buy Bitcoin, and we just automatically follow him, right? Because clearly that's not what humans do. We don't just automatically copy sort of actions. What we copy, I think, is their normative values, that their belief in this case that Bitcoin will be valuable, and that leads to the action. So that's quite an academic and trivial point to delineate.
No, that's an excellent point, because what I think we forget is that if they copied the exact action, they would just buy Bitcoin. But what they're copying is something deeper, which is this ability to grab something very early, which is why they buy an altcoin that launched a month ago instead of Bitcoin, which, if you study this thing a lot more, then you would be buying Bitcoin. Instead, they want to imitate the thing that they perceive as the thing that made, the OG Bitcoiner very successful, which is the willingness, or getting into something very early, and that's the only thing that they imitate, and not the actual fundamental value that that the OG Bitcoiner found.
That's right. And this idea, to pull it a bit out of economics for a while, that what is what mimesis transmits fundamentally is normative values, is deeply threatening to the modern Western philosophical intuitions, right? This is why many who read Girard consider him a reactionary, not even a conservative, but a reactionary. Because, ask ourselves this: what do if not academic, but the public mind, where does it consider where normative value derives from? I think there's two popular answers. One is as a legacy of the Enlightenment. It says reason, right? Reason is how we get to normative value and how we gain certainty. And the second one, right? And this is why, for example, public discourse is important, right? Mill's sort of argument for free speech. And the second one is romanticism, right? That we, through our own, if not experiences, then the strength of our desires, determines truth. It determines how we know a normative value to be certain, right? And this is behind movements such as the transgender movement, right? Like, you will know if you desire this strong enough, then you have the most privileged epistemic access to what gender you really are. And Girard's mimetic theory goes against both of these treasured Western intuitions. That first, reason is often the spokesperson, a mere defensive lawyer to fundamental intuitions that are actually grounded socially. And second, the strength of our desire is often not correlated at all to their legitimacy. Right? After all, we do desire luxury goods strongly. We can desire a very problematic partner. In fact, if a desire is too strong, Girard instead thinks of it as suspect, as being fundamentally motivated by this desire to be and not attributed to any real world sort of qualities. And so, to zoom out a little bit, you're right in thinking that he's sort of tearing down the fundamental assumptions of modern economics, but that's only because he's tearing down the fundamental assumptions of modernity as a whole.
and indeed, that's one of the more interesting insights to me, because the basis of a lot of the analysis, especially in economics, is based on empiricism. Here are these numbers and here are those numbers, and they try to sort of fit certain formulas and say that this is why X or Y happened, when in fact it's much more fundamental or deeper, and occurs at sort of like the person to person level, where your desires, your dreams are affected by the community that surrounds you, and they don't arise independently and aren't completely utilitarian or rational. It's oftentimes based on, what you observe and the people that you've seen.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on from here, because the other thing that I really wanted to talk about is mimetic violence. Can you explain this concept?
Yeah, and I think we've already briefly touched upon this, right? An example of rivalry. So an example of rivalry, we've discussed how relationships can be negative sum. That I gain, whether it's legitimate or not, and I think most people listening, if they introspect, they would realize this, that we tend to attribute blame to others for our own sort of senses of lack, whether it's warranted or not, right? Or to put another way, maybe the human drive for causality and for a story, once that is applied to our own suffering, which Girard sees as constitutive to the human experience, makes us readily project blame onto others. And Girard's belief is that in different historical circumstances, once the collective suffering is enough, we will start attributing blame upon one group of people and expel them. And the reason that this mechanism works is often not that people are actually guilty, that they're responsible for the systemic issues, but that we, again, as social spirited creatures, have this built up, pent up anger that requires catharsis to relieve us. So you see how this fundamental difference in assumptions, right? One small difference in assumptions of who humanity is just changes everything, right? All the way from economic theory, all the way to conflict resolution. And so Girard thinks that, Hobbes, very famously, and I think this is actually a wrong reading of Hobbes, but, Girard thinks that Hobbes believes that in the middle of war of all against all, when everyone is angry and at each other's throats, the way peace can be achieved is the coming together, using reason to create some kind of social contract, a sort of rational understanding that, if we were all to come together and establish a state with all these controls, right, the Leviathan, then all of us would win, and all of us will, succeed in the game of self-preservation. And Girard says this is ridiculous because the precise moment when the social contract is needed the most, it is available the least, right? If you've ever been into an argument, let alone against different nations and different groups of people who've been slaughtering you, but even to a friend that you've just been mad at for a few days, you know that reason is the most impotent at that time. And so Girard's explanation instead of how conflict is resolved is purely symbolic, catharsis, right? And he gives a plethora of examples here, but the one I think our listeners would most agree with is the relationship with the Nazis and the Jews, right? Where the Jews were blamed for the decline of the Weimar Republic, they were scapegoated, and they were sort of wrongfully expelled, which led to a massive, cathartic event.
I was reflecting on this whole scapegoating mechanism, especially in the modern world, because I think it's very easy to forget that, justice isn't necessarily like a natural human instinct. It's something that we almost have to be taught. And, I think Girard's idea is basically like, we kind of throw out justice and blame some other people just so we can move on and like sort of experience the catharsis that we talked about. I was thinking about just in the realm of politics, and particularly in the Democratic Party, how the vice presidential candidate, whenever they lose, tends to end up being kind of the scapegoat, right?
Right.
Year 2000, you had Gore versus Bush, and the VP candidate on the Democratic side, the side that lost, is, of course, Joe Lieberman. He gets alienated from his own party, speaks at the Republican convention 8 years later, and more or less becomes a persona non grata in the Democratic Party. Similar thing with Jonathan Edwards, who also lost to Bush, as the bottom part of the Democratic ticket in 2004. And, even going back further, you can, look at like Spiro Agnew as the actual VP under Nixon, kind of going away with scandal. And that was their sort of attempt to find a scapegoat. This mechanism seems to be very common, where it's not necessarily like physical death, like maybe it was in ancient times or in contemporary North Korea, for example. But instead, it's almost like a political or social death, which could be, like the whole idea of cancel culture, where you just sort of kill them in online or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think you're already intuiting the most important movements of the scapegoat mechanism, or rather maybe qualities. One is that the victim, the scapegoating is unjust, not because the victim is fully innocent, but that the extent to which they were blamed is wrong, right? So, did the vice presidents of the Democratic Party contribute to their loss in the case of when they lose? Probably. But were they the sole and single cause? Almost certainly not, right? And so scapegoats often have different qualities that sort of mark them out. One quality is that they need to be near to the social order. And the reason is because, it's not that satisfying or even believable to say, that guy over there, 5,000 miles away from us that we've never interacted with, he's the problem for all of our struggles, right? That clearly doesn't work. However, the scapegoat also has to be very far. And the reason here is that if you expel someone close to the power nexus of a group, you don't gain catharsis. You just start another strand of violence. This happened, for example, in Greek myth. This is what Girard brings up with Agamemnon and Iphigenia. Right? Agamemnon has to sacrifice Iphigenia to gather, and he pissed off one of the gods, I think it was Athena, to get wind so that the Greeks could sail to Troy. Of course, Iphigenia is his daughter, and at the very core of the Spartan power nexus. And what happens next? Well, his wife, when Agamemnon comes back to Sparta, kills him out of vengeance. And then Agamemnon's son, Orestes, kills Clytemnestra, and so on and so forth. So the vice president is interesting because they are both near and far from the social order, right? Where they are near, obviously, because they're in power, but they're far because they're not important, right? That's why they're the vice president, or they're not that important. You can't axe the main guy. And so, one historical example of this is obviously the European aristocracy intermarried a lot, and Marie Antoinette, her Russian status in the French Revolution and the trials that ensued was often brought up as a reason, right, for persecution. And I think a figure like Marie Antoinette is the perfect scapegoat because they are so near to the social order yet so far, right? They have no connections in France beyond their sort of marriage, but they are near because they're core to the power nexus. So perhaps the vice president fulfills the same role after losing an election.
Yeah, and that's, to me, one of the really fascinating things. One of the things that one of my friends that is a Bitcoiner and, is familiar with Girard that he said to me, which I want to get your take on, is that he thinks that in many ways, Satoshi is anti-mimetic in the sense that you can't imitate Satoshi, because we know very little about Satoshi, and there are no sort of objects to which we can attach our desire. There's no, because it's an anonymous figure, that somebody, that it's sort of outside our purview, and really all of our knowledge about Satoshi is almost entirely speculative. That ends up actually making it very difficult to have this social status game that a lot of other systems end up with. What do you think of this idea that Satoshi is anti-mimetic?
Yeah, there's a lot of probably interesting strands, but my first thought is that I probably disagree with that. And mostly because, as we discussed before, the less well-defined something is, the more room there is for mimesis to operate, right? And this goes back to our conversation about assets and how something with clear fundamentals is much less subject to contagion than something with not. And this sort of statement that your friend articulated, that someone so speculative and ill-defined cannot be a model, I don't think is right, because as Girard clearly thinks, fictional people can be role models as well, right? Like Amadea Gaul for Don Quixote, obviously the Greek heroes. And so I would say that premise is wrong, and he might be even more mimetic because our imagination can be given free rein to sort of theorize who he was, right? Put another way, if he was revealed to be this, aging, unfit 70-year-old, right? A very unappealing, unattractive figure living in his mom's basement. Perhaps perhaps he would be a lot less, have a lot less mimetic valence than he does today.
Well, it's interesting to me because what I've seen in the altcoin space, particularly with founders, is that they don't imitate Satoshi at all. Instead, what they tend to do is imitate Vitalik Buterin, who is clearly at the top of the altcoin hierarchy.
Yeah.
And, they sort of almost always say sort of weird things that he does. He has sort of a mannerism that's very
distinct. Yeah.
I don't know. Almost very nerdy. They try to imitate that. He condemns Bitcoiners as Bitcoin maximalists. They sort of imitate that as well. There's a lot of imitating going on because they want to be him, right? The guy that made, billions of dollars creating an altcoin or something like that, rather than, doing something like Satoshi did. There's, at least as far as I can tell, the people in the space, especially in altcoins, they have no interest in imitating Satoshi because he doesn't. Yeah, there's nothing to go and be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see. And from that perspective, then I would think that your friend's argument could have some ground where there's so little that Satoshi offers, right, of what he's interested in, of what his beliefs are, other than that one white paper, that he doesn't really give us much. And here, what this reminds me of is Girard is saying, it's not just about the heightened being of a model that makes us want to imitate him, but obviously it's about what objects he's associated with, right? And so the example that Girard gives is that I think a relic of a saint is much more important and desirable mimetically than a rosary that the saint simply touches, because the object is closer to him, right? And the same is true for us wanting to be like Michael Jordan. When we say, I want to be like Mike, we don't go and shave our heads bald. We go and buy Jordan sneakers, even though being bald and having sneakers are equally qualities of Michael Jordan. One is considered to be, one set of objects is considered to be much more proximate to the model. And so here, maybe the idea goes something like, because Satoshi never had any objects that you could associate with him with, then he's antimimetic in that regard, right? Not because he's undesirable, not because his being is not heightened, but because there's just, even if you do want to imitate him, he casts such a broad light that he doesn't point to anything in particular.
Right. And that to me is, and even if you were to imitate him, you'd have to be anonymous on the internet. No one would even know that you were trying to imitate him. So it's extremely problematic in that regard to imitate him, at least strictly speaking. The two things he's known for is creating Bitcoin and being anonymous. Like that's how do you imitate something like that?
That's actually really interesting. And I'm going to piss off a lot of my Christian friends, but this is what Girard says about Jesus. That Jesus is a healthy model for us because of his distance. And this actually applies exactly to Satoshi. And my friends are really going to kill me when I say this, but he said that, Jesus, at the very moment he could dominate, he withdrew. Obviously, he's referring, or I don't know if obviously, but he's referring to the moment when Jesus came back from the dead, right? If he were to show up to the Jewish and the Roman authorities, then he'd be made the king of the world, right? Clearly, this guy just came back from the dead. Clearly, there's something here. But Girard says, no, Jesus chose to withdraw. And it's that withdraw that we must also imitate, right? And this is why Girard, very pessimistically, the only solution he prescribes for mimesis in the time we're in is withdraw, just to leave the world. And he's not very clear on the positive do what, but the example he gives is Holderlin, right? The 19th century poet, contemporary of Schelling and Hegel, who literally holed himself up in a tower for the last, I think it was like 20 years or 40 years of his life, just completely anonymous from the world. And so in that regard, Satoshi also invites us to withdraw in some sense, right? And he's actually difficult to imitate because of that. I actually really like that. I'm coming around to your friend's position.
Yeah, well, that is very interesting, because the obvious question, I think, for people that are curious about Girardian thought is, okay, like there is, they might agree with everything that we've said so far, but the obvious question afterwards is, so what do I do about it, right? Like the desires are still there. We still want to be like Mike, as you put it. What do we do? Do we get rid of that desire? Do we deny it? Do we starve it to death? How do we act in a way that we aren't affected by these weird status games that like sort of consume us?
Yeah. That's a great question, and one that you should not go asking Girard. One, because he's dead. And the second is because he really has nothing really to offer you here. Or just very, very little, right? He explicitly said, I'm not in the business of giving you positive ideals. I'm just going to tell you what is. And in fact, he does say it's up to posterity to sort of try to understand him best and try to figure out what to do. So in some sense, we're doing perhaps the most Girardian activity possible. Now, obviously, this question has plagued me for the last 4 to 5 years. So I've thought quite a lot about this. And I have a few sort of ways of response. The model that I think that one could live in, I'm not saying it's the only one or even the best one, but it's simply the one that I'm stumbled upon, is I think the end state is the best end state to live consistently is to renounce this desire to be. And Girard does think it's possible. And in fact, he gives stories that are of sort of Eastern religious heroes who let go of this desire, perhaps not unlike the Buddhist drive to extinguish this desire, as examples of what can be achieved. So it's clear that Girard believes it is both good and it is possible to extinguish this desire. And let me remind you, with this desire to be gone, we're not vegetables, because we still have that desire to experience, right? And in fact, at least in my own life, the more I've gotten rid of this desire to be, I think the more content and happy and perhaps even successful I've become. Like this Girard project it almost, in the beginning, it started because of the metaphysical desire with Thiel, right? But eventually it became almost an exclusive physical desire for the joy of understanding and reading Girard. And the more and more, and I switched from CS to philosophy to study Girard, and that was the complete switch from metaphysical desire to physical desire, right? I just liked philosophy in and for its own sake. CS was more about, I want to be an entrepreneur. And that is I think the end state that I'm still striving for. And then the question is, like, how do we get there? And here, this is not Girard at all. I'm just making this shit up. I'm taking an approach of accelerationism. And so accelerationism, popularized by a thinker such as Nick Land, who's still alive today, actually, is the idea that for a political system that you do not want to live in, the best way is to accelerate the logic of such a system. This is quite a Hegelian idea, right? That if we push the immanent logic of something to its core, it will lead to the conditions to engender the next stage. And some have read Marx in Das Kapital as an accelerationist. That the true Marxists today are the billionaires, because they're the ones who are pushing the logic of capital and exploitation. Again, I'm not saying I believe this. I'm saying this is what a Marxist would say, to its end. So to break the system so fundamentally that the sort of socialist utopia can be established, right? And so and I'm sort of using that same logic for my own life and the current metaphysical desires that I've had, because looking back, I've realized that the most, at least for me, effective way to get rid of these metaphysical desires is really to obtain them, right? And for me, it was either, dating beautiful women or getting into an Ivy League or doing this and doing that. And what I realize is, because these desires are illusionary, once you get them, you have the immediate experience to realize that they're illusionary. This also happened, by the way, for me in gaming. As a young kid, I just used to play World of Warcraft like 24/7. But then I just became so exhausted about it, right? And I think, again, this isn't just me making up excuses for my hedonism. There is sort of a deep and long religious tradition, or different religious traditions that take upon this idea. Because, fundamentally, one way to look at this journey that we are embarking upon is a religious journey, right? It's renouncing the world effectively. I was studying in this Buddhist monastery in Nepal, and, one of the other students there was a Hindu scholar. And I knew, and I still know very little about Hinduism, but what she told me was the end of Hinduism is very similar to the end of Buddhism, right? The escape of a cycle of suffering. Now, for the Buddhists, right, the next logical step, or at least according to some earlier schools, is to meditate on the perversities of the world. One example of such a meditation would be, to have in mind the body of a beautiful woman and then imagine it as a rotting corpse, right? But what the Hindu scholars said that really surprised me is that Hinduism did the exact opposite. That it not only prescribed, but gave a very rigorous and detailed handbook of enjoying worldly pleasures. Now, there's many different interpretations of why this is, but I think the most interesting one is satire. And what she told me was one way to interpret why Hinduism, which had an equally world-renouncing goal, prescribed worldly pleasures instead of, seemingly the logical Buddhist reaction, which is to renounce worldly pleasures, is because it's a sort of satire, that it wants to give you all the orgies and all the feasts and all the festivities until you, through your experience alone, can validate its sort of nothingness. And that is in some sense the journey that I think I'm on. I have clear desires that I've had since a kid, and I aim to satisfy them. And I think by satisfying them, I will become disillusioned by them. Now, obviously, I don't think this can be. This is not a effectively replicated strategy by everyone. It requires, one, I think, you having a greater thing to go to after disillusionment. And for me, that's without a doubt philosophy. Two, it requires you to be quite effective in the world into obtaining the things that you want, right? Otherwise, you're going to spend like 70 years of your life trying to get these things, and by that time, it will be too late. And three, I think it requires constant introspection. So it's not just a mindless indulgence and not just a license for just pure hedonism. So that is the path that I've taken upon, or the large stroke. But that is not Girardian. That's not canonically Girardian in any sense of the word.
Yeah, that's interesting that you've gone down that route, because for me, feels like the more effective thing is to go the other way, which is almost too fast from a lot of this stuff, and recognize that you really don't need it after a while. Like like desiring, to get, I don't know, some Lambo or something like that. It's just like, okay, just fast from it for a while. All the inputs that give you that sort of inflame that desire.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes away on its own almost.
Yeah. And here, I'm tempted to draw a distinction between desires that are core and less core, right? Like, for example, I maybe have like a very tiny desire to drive a Lambo, but it's not very strong. And in that case, I can just renounce it and get rid of it. But to be an entrepreneur, to be, a worldly success, I think, unfortunately, I was exposed to that ideal too strong, too young, and for too long to be able to renounce it in the same way. And this is what actually Girard says about Clausewitz, the famous philosopher of war as well as general in the Prussian army. He said that Clausewitz, unfortunately, grew up as a banner boy in the Prussian military. And as a result, he had no choice. Like, remember how we talked about how our models ground our fundamental normative intuitions about what's wrong or right? In an example of Clausewitz, military glory and sort of historic heroism is something that he cannot escape from. And so I think, and the Tibetans had a really good line here, it's better not to begin things, but once you've begun, it's better to finish them. And in a similar way, I think if we were to examine ourselves, for certain desires that we have that is much more easily renounced, fasting is, I think, the much better route. But I think for many people, there are also a deep set of desires that are so rooted in their identity that renouncing them would actually create resentment and not freedom. I.e., if I were, to go into the academy today, I think I would be very resentful of worldly success. And I would maybe be a Marxist or be an anti-political thinker because I'm resentful of my peers in industry, right? And this is a real problem, right? That plagues people, resentment. So I think.
Wait. So are you? Wait. Let me just get what you said straight. You think a lot of academics end up sort of like almost Marxist because they have an envy or a resentment of the people in industry?
That's probably too broad of a claim, but I think directionally that's correct. Yeah.
Wow, that's a very interesting insight because, I think that's a question that a lot of people have been asking. Why are academics so much to the left?
Yeah, I mean, academics, right? They're compared to what they were historically. In China, you tested your way into the royal court. Academics were always in the religious eras, right? You were priests that had some political function. Today, academics are incredibly impotent by comparison, right? The only people who, in the humanities at least, can even be called that get any sort of worldly action are economics, right? Philosophy, humanities, these sort of really roles that were like made you into a cupbearer or gave you a lot of worldly influence today makes you rather impotent, right? And so again, this is too broad of a statement, but I think it is one psychological motor of why so many people in the academy are on the economic left today, right? That there's actually a brilliant book. It's called let me pull it up. I think it's called The Rise of the Intellectual Class, that basically tries to critique. It's a Marxist critique of the academy, and it tries to identify the psychological motivators. Okay, The Future of Intellectuals and the Rise of the New Class by Alvin Goldner. I think Alvin Goldner is a renegade Marxist who used Marxist analysis to critique the intellectual class as having its own sort of class ambitions and class insecurities. I actually think this is one of his ideas as well.
Very interesting. And so having that, like fasting from something won't necessarily work if you still, I guess, in a sense, desire it really strongly. Is that the line?
Yeah. And maybe we can start tying everything together now. This sort of Greek nouveau rich and the old money, right? Between the aristocracy. I mentioned one of the reactions of the aristocracy was to change what they fundamentally thought value to be, right? Honor instead of money. But they no less desired money, right? Like they were still after it. And the same thing happened again with the nouveau riche, that they acted to ban politically aristocratic practices such as pederasty, but really secretly everyone started practicing them. And so it's this idea that there are core desires or core self-conceptions that one has grown up with that you can't really renounce. Or if you think you renounced it, you're really resentful. And the only way out is through. And let me give you an actual example. This is a perfect example that'll tie everything together. So I had an acquaintance in college who, when I met him in freshman year, was an economic progressive, right? Distributed justice, cares a lot about the poor. And I was like, what a great guy, how compassionate. And then I noticed something very odd, right? That he was like just really rude to other people. And, his stated compassion was nowhere to be found. And, when we were in junior year, he confessed to me that his distaste for money and capital was a less caring for the poor than hatred of the rich. And the reason is because he grew up as a middle-class person in an upper class environment. And so was always made to feel worse off, especially in the economic domain, than his richer peers. And so progressive economics for him was really a weapon to secure moral victory, right? And in fact, what he's doing now for graduation, he's an investment banker. And the reason is because he never really had a problem with money. He only appeared to hate it so much because he wanted it so badly. And his renunciation was really not a renunciation at all, but a deep form of resentment.
So I guess you fall into the possible trap of deceiving yourself and thinking that you've actually renounced it when in fact you're just inflaming your own desire,
or
by
you're after
denying
it
it
in different means, but I think the most devastating thing here is that, just like mimesis, this form of resentment, this sort of pushing away from the crowd, you're still not doing the thing for its own sake, right? Like if I grew up with a bunch of Marxists and I became a Marxist, then mimesis can lead me astray because I'm doing the thing because that's what everyone else is doing. Now, in the case of my friend, or my acquaintance rather, mimesis still leads him astray, but negatively, right? He's doing it because that's what other people are not. And that's the logic of resentment. But in both cases, you're living a life that is fundamentally not your own.
And that's really kind of the modern dilemma, isn't it? Like there's so few things that are our own. We borrow from everybody else because there are mimetic models everywhere, and they are all sort of like vying for our attention. And finding a good mimetic model or something like that can be so challenging that, living in the modern world in some sort of reasonable way becomes a very difficult task.
Yeah, and then Jimmy, I'll end with this with this idea, and it'll also be a little shameless sort of teaser for the rest of the lecture series. Is that there's something unique about the modern world that makes it much more susceptible to mimetic forces, and that has to do with the proliferation, loosely speaking, of equality. That in olden times, gender roles, caste systems, guild lineages, how oppressive they may have been, narrowly constrain who we compete and imitate against to a very narrow and an established group of people, and therefore making our lives a lot easier. But now, right, we demand access for all. We tell children that they can be anything that they want to be. And as a result, they have to, in their older age, have to face up to and make excuses for all the things that they are not. And so Girard, however, does think that equality is an ultimate good. He thinks that it's brought about by Christ, but he thinks it is very devastating and, in fact, apocalyptic and violent consequences. And for the exact reason why that is, I think your listeners are going to have to wait for the rest of the lecture series, specifically lectures 6 and 7.
Yeah, that's an intriguing concept, and I suspect that it has a lot to do with sort of like the elimination of differences in almost every society at this point, which I mean, they might be there. There's probably a lot of upside, but there's also some downside, particularly with respect to how much more competition there is in any particular endeavor. Okay, so where can people find you? Where is this, series on Girard that people can find and so on?
Yeah, so if you go on YouTube and you Google Johnathan with an H, John, Johnathan at Limbo, that's the name of the YouTube channel. And we'll have the first lecture out already. It's an overview of the entire lecture series. So it covers everything that we talked about today, including this sort of trajectory of history. And then we're going to be rolling out the rest 6 lectures once every month to month and a half.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you haven't read Girard or don't know anything about him, the intro is an excellent way to get exposure to these very interesting ideas. I think ideas that aren't necessarily being promulgated in academia or anything like that. But I think it's definitely worth reading and finding out more about from a philosophical perspective. So thank you, Johnathan, for coming on.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Unchained Capital is a sponsor of this podcast. I'm an advisor to the company. I know the team well, and I'm excited for what they are building. If you need multi-sig collaborative custody or a Bitcoin native financial services partner, learn more at unchained.com. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. Johnathan Bi can be found at Johnathan Bi with an H and jonathanbi.com. Until next time, fiat delenda est.